Okay, so how to add accessibility to specs so it would be clear to developers what is expected from them. Oh, 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 oh. Indeed, indeed.
Is this the this is a test first question, isn't it? It's the how do we? Well, I'm not going to say shift left. I mean,
Well, could be.
Yeah, no. I think the point is, it ties a little bit into how do you get buy-in to this stuff, right? So, chucking a requirement into a spec isn't necessarily going to solve your problem. It's not. You might try and develop against that requirement, but then you're getting into the realms of having to have everything written down in huge amounts of detail.
Yeah, indeed.
The answer really is to understand the problem you're trying to solve, and maybe find a way of getting the do sessions with teams. I'm not saying don't. I would be a little bit vague with accessibility when I'm including them in requirements, purely because I think discussions need to be had. I want to drive discussions out around accessibility. I don't want it just to be something that they can somebody can tick off. I want them to understand why we're doing this change. So I guess my answer is I would add comments into specs to say we need to consider this. If we're using specs, and maybe include notes there to say if wider discussion is needed on this. So there's lots of things. Using things like wireframes is always useful because you can step through and understand that usability aspect. But that's better done in a pair or in a group, or so that you can understand the difference between the non-accessible and the accessible. I think the problem when I've seen developers trying to build accessibility in before, I see a lot of them doing development and building accessible features because they've been told to do it, and because that it's in the requirement. And I'd want to step away from that whole concept of doing it because it's in the requirement. So maybe using visuals as an aid for any kind of discussion around that, or as an aid to the requirement. I've just noticed that somebody's put personas which are really useful as well. So driving it through the context of the person behind that change, going back to that person at the center of what you're doing, is going to drive the discussion, is going to drive the understanding better than just a requirement on a page.
I really like this question. It's made me think of things like security and performance and all the others. It's kind of like, do you explicitly do that as a separate thing, or do you weave some of it into just your everyday, day-to-day testing? Because I've seen, I mean, on this Ask Me Anything session, I've seen people advocate for that kind of thing, where you're how to get security testing, as part of your, CI pipeline, for example, or how do you benchmark your performance requirements all the time, and so you're just constantly measuring against that. Is there a similar kind of way to? Yeah,
ultimately,
do you think
it's just? I don't want to say it's just another requirement. Whatever we're building into a product, we need to understand, right? When people are at the heart of this product, we're building it for somebody, for a purpose, for somebody. So accessibility is just another part of that. Now, I think it's valuable to take it. Yes, we can weave it in. It needs to be weaved in. It needs to be parcel of people's consideration, because it needs to become the norm, rather than that thing where people say, "Oh, we've got to pick up a bit of accessibility testing now." We don't. It should be part of people's considerations as they go through all the time, as with everything. However, I think it is something that needs a bit of dedicated time from an understanding perspective. So those brown bag sessions, those those lunchtime talks, those little workshops to understand what we're trying to achieve from an accessibility perspective are really valuable to be taken to one side. But yeah, ultimately, day to day, you need to be looking at asking the questions right in the same way as you would anything else when you're developing software, asking the questions of how are we going to make sure this is accessible? How are we going to make sure that this is going to survive, going to be available for a wider audience? In the same way as you would with performance. At the start, you'd say, how are we going to make sure that this is going to be usable by 10 million people at the same time, or whatever? That's a question you ask up front. You ask the same concept is with accessibility, and then you weave it in as part of that. Once you've asked those questions, you weave it into how you want to develop, how you want to build the product. Because if you don't, then it becomes a lot more painful, like everything else does.
Yeah, I watched a talk some years ago, and the chap giving the talk, I think his name was Paco Hope. And what he kind of said was, because he was a security tester, and he was like saying, look, you do need to do some security testing, and I'm like a very expensive, badass security tester. So when I come in, what you don't want me to do is be wasting time on the really obvious things that you could have caught without me. Was basically the point of what he was saying. So it's like, still do that specific security testing, but there's some low-hanging fruit stuff that you and your team should just be taking care of, and that's what this is reminding me of. It's reminding me of that, actually.
Yeah.
Awesome, lovely.
Yes, it's got to be treated like everything else, but at the same time, it's a
specialism.
It needs consideration in separation.
Yeah, awesome, lovely question.